Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope you had fun in there. I'm Carlin. I help to co-coordinate the series with Amy. And now, really without further ado, I'd like to invite Amy Starcheski to welcome Winona for us.
Thank you, Carlin. And thank you, Winona, for being with us. And thank you all for joining us. For those of you who weren't here at the beginning, I'm Amy Starcheski and I direct the Oral History Master of Arts program. And Winona sent in a very spare bio, which says only that she's the Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan and a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation. Which to me captures things that are very important about Winona and also misses things like the fact that her work is one of the readings that we assign every year in the first weeks of OMA, that it's foundational to the way that we think about oral history, that she's a leading scholar who thinks in very important and exciting ways about how academic oral history and Indigenous oral history overlap and intersect and diverge and live in tension and sometimes in harmony with each other. She's a scholar activist whose work is exemplified by her work on land claims that we'll hear about tonight. And I think most importantly, sort of to me personally, is that her career and her life is really built and grounded in the deep and long and hard and loving work of relationship and of community. And we're so grateful to have her as a part of our OMA and our oral history community. This event of having her be able to speak publicly with us has been long delayed due to geography. And so it's something that I'm grateful for in the context of this pandemic, that we've been pushed to begin to gather online and be able to bring together people from all over the world to hear speakers like Winona. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to her. Please join me in welcoming Winona Wheeler tonight.
Thank you, Amy. Danse and Tuau, I shake hands with each and every one of you here today, and I bring greetings from my home here in the traditional lands of the Willow Cree peoples of Treaty 6 territory. Thank you for the introduction, Amy. Thank you, Amy and Carlin, for inviting me to share a few stories with you today. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. I want to show it. We're having difficulties with my Wi-Fi, but I'll do my best. So, okay, so back on board. So historian, I'm a historian, I'm a trained historian, and to historians, as you know, context is absolutely everything. So I'm going to spend these first few minutes talking briefly about the land back movement and what it means to Indigenous peoples. And then from there, I'll talk a bit about the land claims research process and what it entails. And then spend some time on what we learn about, a little bit about what we learn about human-land relations when we do oral history research and how oral histories have been treated in the claims process. I want to stress right now that I'm not an expert in land claims and court decisions, as it's been a long time since I was directly involved in land claims research. And I'm not a lawyer, so please bear with my very, very simple summaries of legal cases. What I'm sharing comes from different places. It comes from a little bit of my experiences and the experiences of current active land claims researchers. I selected this piece of art by Darian Weiss for this cover because it so clearly represents what the land back movement is all about. You know, the land back movement is not just about land. It's about everything that's connected to the land, the ways of life that arise from and are centered on the land. And the land back movement is as old as the beginning of colonial intrusions into Indigenous lands in the Americas. There's been absolutely no time in our shared colonial history where we were not defending our lands, protecting our inherent rights to live on and access the resources of our lands, what the lands provide, or organizing, fighting, and sacrificing to regain lost lands. So just over the past year, we've seen hundreds of solidarity protests and lobbies in support of Indigenous issues across the Americas. North of the Medicine Line, actions sprung up, for example, in support of the Wet'suwet'en clans, protecting their traditional lands against the construction of Coastal GasLink pipeline that was sanctioned by the BC British Columbia Supreme Court when it issued an injunction to allow the construction of that in December of 2019. The Peiki Winona protest camp was set up in a public park in downtown Edmonton to protest police violence against homeless people. And at the height of the protest, there was like 170 tents there, most of which housed homeless people. Last July, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations people and their supporters set up the barricaded camp on a piece of land in what is now called New Caledonia to stop a proposed housing development site on unceded traditional lands. The claim goes back to the Haldimand Treaty of 1784 that set aside roughly about 950,000 acres of land on either side of the Grand River for the use and benefit of the Six Nations people. But they were unable to protect their lands against the swarm of colonial settlers. And so over the years, it was chipped away at by settlement, big chunks flooded by the building of the Welland Canal. The land defenders renamed the road on that site, the road that site is located on, 1492 Landback Lane. An example south of the Medicine Line occurred July 3rd when land protectors set up a roadblock at the Mount Rushmore in Hassapa, the sacred Black Hills, as Trump made his way up for the controversial 4th of July event. The roadblock didn't last long, and 21 defenders were arrested, but it brought national attention to Indigenous relations with the Black Hills, the broken treaties, and their critique that Mount Rushmore represents colonialist white supremacy at its finest. The NDN Collective grew out of that protest and launched the Land Back campaign on social media October 21st of last year, Indigenous Peoples Day in the US. A little bit of background information about this one. Shortly after the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty, gold prospectors flocked into the Black Hills. The US government quickly abandoned and violated their treaty obligations, deploying military forces to the area and attempting to legalize the seizure of land through federal legislation. This blatant land theft paved the way for the construction of Mount Rushmore by a known KKK sympathizer in the 1920s. Many years later, in 1980, the US Supreme Court ruled the United States government theft of the land unconstitutional. The Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun summarized the US's disregard for the Fort Laramie Treaty obligations in a court opinion. He said, and I quote, "A more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never, in all probability, be found in our history." What is unique about the Land Back movement is that it strives to reclaim more than just land. As the NDN campaign in the Dakotas explained, the movement is about the reclamation of everything stolen from original peoples. The editors of a recent Briar Patch special edition on Land Back further explain, Land Back is the demand to rightfully return colonized land, like that in so-called Canada, to Indigenous peoples. But when we say land back, we aren't asking for just the ground or for a piece of paper that allows us to tear up and pollute the earth. We want the system that is land to be alive so that it can perpetuate itself and perpetuate us as an extension of itself. That's what we want back. Our place in keeping land alive and spiritually connected. So the true value of the land is not in and of itself. A colleague of mine, Dr. Alex Wilson, learned from her father that in and of itself, in Cree, the land, a ski, is inanimate. Okay. On its own, it has no spirit, because all alone, it cannot perpetuate itself. Rather, it requires rain, it requires the sun, it requires air. I would add it requires seasonal rejuvenation and other living things upon it. And through those symbiotic and spiritual relations, the land comes to life. So it's the whole system that's alive and keeps life going. So when we speak of land, we're referring to the entire interconnected ecosystem, including its people and their ways of life. My late husband used to say, "The land is my chief." And that teaching tells us that we're not the boss of the land, that our lives depend on her, and we need to treat her with respect and deference in order for us to keep surviving. The land back movement strives to decolonize our relations with the land, read ecosystem and interrelations, by rejecting heartless commodification and gross exploitation and restoring healthy, mutually beneficial relations. The recent moniker or hashtag represents a unity of experiences and campaigns across North America. It emerged as a mechanism to connect, coordinate, resource, and amplify this movement and the communities that are fighting for land back. Regaining dispossessed Indigenous lands requires a huge amount of effort, huge amount of resources, human and financial, and time, often years, and in some cases, decades. Until the early 1970s, there was no mechanism in place in present-day Canada to facilitate the claims process. The First Nations people in Canada were prohibited by law from launching litigation or land claims cases against the federal government until 1951. Not long after some really significant court cases, the Office of Native Claims was developed to assess and adjudicate claims. The process took many, many years, and many claims were rejected, which left little recourse except to go through the courts. So this slide shows you that in Canada, there's two kinds of claims we have. We have comprehensive claims, where Aboriginal title has never been, quote unquote, extinguished. In other words, there's no treaties that the government believes actually facilitated the surrender of land, which actually didn't happen. Specific claims are another batch of different kinds of claims. They can happen in treaty and non-treaty areas, non-fulfillment of treaty obligations, breach of fiduciary responsibilities and Indian Act, illegal sales and dispossessions. So there's two kinds of claims and there's two kinds of claims process. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that it's the federal government that set up what those criteria are. And so it's the federal government that determines whether or not a claim that we launch is actually a legitimate claim. So it took, what we had in place was the Office of Native Claims set up as a specific claims process. And that process, I mean, this is kind of what it looks like, right? I mean, you launch your claim. Does the claim meet the standard? No, it's out. Does the claim meet the standard? Yes, then you go through an assessment. That should take up to 3 years. Was the claim accepted for negotiation? No, it's out. Yes, then the negotiation period continues. Was a settlement reached? So it's a huge, huge process. The reality is this chart shows that it might take 6 or 7 years. The reality is that a lot of cases that went through this claims process, through the specific claims branch, took decades. Absolutely decades to complete. It was a really slow process that wasn't very helpful at all. We now have a specific claims tribunal process that facilitates specific claims. And we have a treaty process that's addressing the comprehensive claims. So I was hired as a research trainee by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs way back in the day, in the late 70s in Vancouver. And my job was to work on land claims cases. And I had no idea how to do historical research when I started. I was a high school dropout. I was given a band council resolution from the First Nation signed by them, which gave me permission to access their land files and records held by the federal government. And then with a map to figure out where that land was, one of the first things I was trained to do was to go out to the community to see that piece of land and to talk to the people who knew that land, who know that land, and have some idea of how it was lost. It was pretty basic. So with map in hand, I'd go out to the community, I'd go to the band office where I'd meet one of the counselors who'd brief me about the claim and identified old people in the community who knew more about this piece of land. And then I went visiting those old people in their homes. And this is where I learned that the teachings that my grandparents and my mother passed on to us when I was a kid, is actually the foundation for what we call Indigenous research methodologies. Okay. Basically, they taught us that when you're in another people's territory, in other people's land, you learn their protocols. You watch, you study, you ask questions, you learn how they do things. And so that was the first step, right? Is you be a good guest. You learn how to learn in a local context, and you make yourself useful. You know, you don't just sit around and expect people to serve you tea. You get up and make the tea and the coffee for the old people. You go out there and drive them around. You go out there and help them hoe potatoes. I have hoed many potatoes in my time. You go out there and haul wood, and I was no good at chopping, but I could make pretty decent kindling. You offer yourself in exchange for what they're about to share you. But again, it's all based on local protocols, and the onus is on you as the learner, the oral historian, I guess, to go out there and learn how to learn in that local context. One of the most important things I learned doing land claims research was the importance of place, of the land. So when I would go out there and do the first interview, because we always had more than one interview, I would go and visit people at their kitchen table, and people are really comfortable at their kitchen table. You know, you have a cup of tea, you bring some scones, you bring some goodies for them, and you have a nice visit, and you chit chat, and they start to share things with you. And after a couple of visits, they get more comfortable and they'll share a little bit more. And it's really a beautiful environment to do interviews in. But what we found was that when we took them actually out on the land, that's when their memories exploded. That's when the stories that you hadn't heard before, or may not have been shared, or might not ever been shared at the table, they come out because the land is mnemonic. The land urges and encourages their memory because their experiences on that land. And so you go walking through the land with them, and they talk about this trail and how long this trail has been used and who made this trail, what this trail is used for. You know, they'd look at a tree and they say, well, you notice the bark is coming off of that tree. Well, that tree's got this sort of a disease. And then they show you a place where there was an old car once, you know, that the kids used to play on, but it's all rusted out now. And they tell you the story about who owned that car and where they came from. And then they show you the boundaries of their traditional lands. And they just tell you so much about the land. And the same is true when you're working with people who are coastal people or inland fishing people, when you go out on the lake with them, when you go out in the boats with them, and they talk about not just the water, but they talk about the beaches and the landforms and where they set their weirs, or where they set their nets, and where they camped. And so much about the land just comes alive when you're actually out there with them. And for oral historians who are accustomed to having a nice studio or a desk or somewhere where it's really nice and peaceful and quiet, it can be a little discombobulating being out there on a boat that's slamming against the waves, right? And you're recording stories because that's when the guy decides to tell them. It was when he's steering the boat. But it's a lot of fun, and you learn so much. The other important lesson I learned doing land claims research is why it's so important when we're doing Indigenous research to start with the community. So when you begin your research with the oral history, you end up with way more information than if you had started in an archives or a library, because the old people know the stories of the land. And those are the stories that are alive. They've lived on the land, they interacted with the environment, they know the local settler communities and the individuals. So the stories of the land are rich and they're full. And you get far more doing those interviews with them than you do than you get out of the archives. And so you go out there and you do those interviews first, and then those interviews, the magic about them all is that they inform how you do your archival research. And so if you're just doing basic archival research, you just stick to the basic kind of approaches. But when you've been informed by the oral history, and you take that into the archives with you, you ask a whole lot of different kinds of questions of the archival holdings and the archival documents. And you end up, and what we found was we ended up with, like in litigation, at the examination for discoveries, that we generally had more documents than the Crown did, than the Department of Justice and their team of PhD historians and lawyers did, because we started in the community. That's where we started our research. In those early years, oral history was handed down the generations. It was handed down beyond the memory of the knowledge keeper, as well as the experiential eyewitness accounts. But the memories that were handed down the generation beyond the memory of the knowledge keeper were disallowed as evidence under Canadian law because it was considered hearsay. And so we were confined to relying on eyewitness accounts when doing land claims research. But that was challenged in the Delgamook case. And there's been a lot of work done and studies done on the Delgamook case. And so I'm just going to briefly refer to it here. Lots of work has been done on it, absolutely awesome work. Delgamook was an Aboriginal title case that fell into the comprehensive claims category, but ended up at the British Columbia Supreme Court and then eventually to the Supreme Court of Canada. So in 1987, 51 hereditary chiefs of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en nations launched a case against the province of British Columbia, covering about 54,000 square miles of so-called Crown land. They claimed ownership and jurisdiction over their territory and based their claim under the authority of their traditional houses and clan system. The case was notable for its Aboriginal title issues, but for our purposes, it's unique because they asserted that their oral traditions were a declaration of their title, and they brought their oral traditions to court in the form of their sacred stories and songs about the trails between territories that link them to the land. Some of the ancient stories that they brought to court as evidence went back 10,000 years to the last ice age. The trial judge exempted some of the oral traditions from the hearsay rule. Namely, the trial judge says, okay, evidence of origin and territory is acceptable. Historical evidence based upon declarations by deceased persons, evidence of more recent events to which there may be eyewitnesses still living, and evidence of spiritual beliefs and values. Those were the testimonies, those were the oral histories or oral traditions that that trial judge allowed into court. But in the end, after the elders brought their ceremonies and songs and everything into court, Judge McEachern dismissed the oral traditions he heard on the following grounds. And I quote this from the transcripts. He said, "Much evidence must be discarded or discounted, not because the witnesses are not decent, truthful persons, but because their evidence fails to meet certain standards prescribed by law. If I do not accept the plaintiff's evidence, it will seldom be because I think they are untruthful, but rather because I have a different view of what is a fact and what is a belief." He rejected Indigenous oral histories in favor of documentary evidence. There's since been, like I mentioned, many critiques of the trial judge decision, and the Supreme Court of Canada allowed the appeal and ordered a new trial because of the treatment of evidence by the trial judge. The Supreme Court stated that a Supreme Court decision came down in 97, and it stated that oral evidence must be placed on equal footing with types of historical evidence that courts are familiar with, which usually means documentary evidence, and suggested that had the original trial judge assessed the oral histories correctly, the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en people could have proven their Aboriginal title. Again, there's a lot written about these two cases if you're interested in learning more about them. But while there was that was a rather liberal pronouncement, the Supreme Court did not risk establishing tests. And so without tests, lower courts have continued to do whatever they wanted, including disallowing oral evidence. Oral history has been used in many court cases since the Delgamook decision, but each case has been a struggle. One of the challenges that is faced is that the courts have adopted the differentiation between oral tradition and oral history that Van Sina and many others promote. I'm going to move on to the next case here. This is the Williams case, Williams versus British Columbia. The Chilcotin case resulted in the first declaration of Indigenous title in Canada. It's really a profound case, a big win. This breakthrough case is often cited as having adhered strictly to the Delgamook precedent that oral history evidence must be placed on an equal footing with types of historical evidence that courts are familiar with. But it did this by clearly distinguishing between oral tradition and oral history. Scholar Lorraine Weir explains that separating Chilcotin law from what the court determined to function as history and placing little or no weight on what it construed as evidence. In effect, the court constituted oral tradition as what Ginsburg calls evidence of something else, evidence not according the weight of a historical document, therefore evidence that's not acceptable. So the biggest challenge derives from the reality that the courts rely on Van Sina's division of oral history and oral tradition, which is influenced by diplomatics and quote unquote scientific history. In our world, oral tradition is the method, it's the means, it's the umbrella. Oral history is the content. Oral tradition is the umbrella under which many modes and kinds of historical knowledge is transmitted. And they're all interconnected and they're all interrelated. What the non-Indigenous world, not everybody, but apparently those in courts, what the non-Indigenous world in courts struggle with is that our oral histories do not fit neatly into the binary categories of oral history and oral tradition. It's important to remember that when doing Indigenous oral history, everyone's personal, family, and community histories overlap and they interconnect. All the stories are extensions of the past, and the past influences and is still alive in the present. Our histories are infused into our daily lives. They are lived experiences, whether we experience them themselves or whether those experiences were handed down to us. Furthermore, in most Indigenous societies, there's very little distinction between the physical and the metaphysical, between the mundane daily world and the spiritual world. The spiritual affects daily life, so is not spoken of separately from daily life. Nor did Indigenous peoples fragment knowledge into discipline-like categories like politics, art, history, mythology, natural sciences. They were all interconnected. And so our knowledge is holistic, interrelated, much like the environment is, all interrelated. It's not fragmented. And so when we interview old people in their natural contexts, in the safe places where they tell stories, we don't get clear, precise answers to our questions unless they're very uncomfortable with us, and then they give us little one-liners. They share spiritual stories where those affected or explain something that happened in their lives. They talk about the importance of knowing the land and how to live on the land when you ask them about how they made a living. All things are interconnected. And what's also important is that some of the oral histories come to us not just in basic narratives. They're ingrained in the songs and they're ingrained in ceremonial dances. And so taking them apart, taking them out of context, putting elders on the stand to be questioned is nothing less than intellectual colonialism. The next case I want to talk about is the SayQuake case here. It's been a long haul. We have been making gains. I'm not saying we haven't been making gains. We have been, and this one is the most recent gain. This case is about how courts treat Indigenous oral histories and the knowledge keepers and the way they tell their stories. Okay, so according to usual proceedings in the Canadian court system, a witness gives evidence in court or by deposition individually, one at a time, as individuals. Elders are escorted to the witness stand, and there they're pummeled with questions from the plaintiffs, and then they face cross-examination by defendant lawyers, whose job it is to tear apart their testimony. It's painfully hard watching elders take the stand, some of whom do not speak English fluently, and how they struggle to dissect and dismantle their stories in order to answer specific kinds of questions. When interpreters are required, it's just as hard, because the interpreters are required to do their job with no social interaction with the elder, to be incompassionate and distant. Under cross-examination, witnesses are advised to not even look at anybody on their plaintiff team, because the courts are divided between, the defense side and the plaintiff side. So you're not even allowed to look at the lawyers representing the plaintiff or anybody else on that side. And I recall when I was being cross-examined on the stand many years ago, how absolutely alone and vulnerable I felt. And my late husband noticed that I was really uncomfortable, and he was pretty cheeky, and he jumped up and he ran across the courtroom and he sat behind the federal government lawyers, so that when I was looking at the federal government lawyers, I would see him there as well. And then he would give me the thumbs up and give me that, that connection, that comfort that I needed to help get me through that. It made a huge difference. So you can imagine how the old people feel when they're up there in court. In the SayQuake motion in the BC Supreme Court, the judge allowed, this is what's so cool about it, a panel deposition of the testimony of 4 elders, which meant that they were permitted to tell their oral stories in their own cultural contexts, according to their traditions for truth-telling and the intergenerational transmission of oral history and knowledge. The oral histories need to be told in groups rather than by individuals. And so by being permitted to give testimony by way of deposition, allows them to remain in their community for the telling of the oral stories and to do it within their own cultural context. The testimonies are recorded in the presence of both plaintiffs and defendants, defendants being federal government, provincial government, and in this case, a mining company. And this makes a huge difference for elders who have poor health or are too frail to travel. So I'm going to end here just with a reminder for oral historians that when studying peoples who have different cultural repertoire than you, then we really need to step outside of our comfort zones, right? We need to create space where others are having difficulty creating it for themselves. We have to help them create space. We need to learn how to learn in a different way. And I'm going to end there and open it up for discussion or question.
Thank you, Winona. That was wonderful. Yeah, we have 20 minutes for questions, so a nice robust amount of time. Feel free to, Winona, I'm just going to stop sharing your screen just so we can kind of see more folks.
Okay.
Winona, there's also a question that's come in the chat. Malvika is asking if you could speak to how land claims and the case history or strategies are different in, it says America versus the US, I think Canada versus US.
Thank you.
There's a thought that maybe the different colonial histories and precedents have sort of shaped the strategies differently, or?
I can't speak to what's going on in the US because I haven't done it. I haven't done the work down there. I know that it's different. I know that the treaty process was very different. I know that you've got state authority, where in Canada we don't have provincial authority on First Nations land. So it's a different legal system, different legislation governing different things. And I can't do that comparison. I'm waiting for somebody to come along and do that work or somebody to partner up with to do that work comparatively. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
If other folks want to, yeah, go ahead.
Hi,
My name is Mariana, and I'm from the University of the District of Columbia. We are currently engaging in a Black land loss project, and so I was very intrigued to hear your comments about essentially how to effectively do this work when you don't look like the people that you're doing this work with. And of course, appreciating sort of the guidelines that you were talking about non-duality, ensuring that you're walking into these spaces in a respectful manner. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about effective allyship, right? And like what, as practitioners in this space, when we have these histories, what an effective or perhaps just treatment of the stories that we're carrying forth looks like.
Well, allyship is a big subject in and of itself, right? I mean, I don't like the term ally as much as I like co-conspirator. If you're willing to get in the trenches and get smacked around, welcome. But if you're just willing to stand on the edges and be there for support, no thanks, right? So I think you need to clarify how far and you're willing to go and stick your neck out, for one thing. The other thing is that I encourage my students to, all my students, to approach any research project they're doing from a community engaged place. In other words, don't even start your research project until you've been hanging out with that community and you find out what it is that their priorities are. They'll tell you what their priorities are. They'll tell you what they want done. So community engaged research to me is the priority, not me sitting in the ivory tower saying, oh, this would be really interesting for me to research. I think I'll go and research that. Although I do that a lot. I have a lot of fantasies about the stuff I would like to research, but I don't generally do a research project without it being a community engaged project and going out there and hanging out with them first, seeing what it is they need. And then having research with a purpose. It sounds like the research that you want to do is going to have a purpose. It's going to be of value to the community. And so part of that community engagement process is working with them to identify what their goals are, working with them to identify the methods that they think would be most appropriate to utilize, working with them to determine how to decimate. That's not the word, disseminate the research findings, right? So the community engaged process, I think, is by far the most efficient one. And I encourage my students constantly to come from a place of humility, to come from a place where you believe, you don't just mouth it off, but you believe that you don't know anything, that the people you're doing the research with, they're the knowledge holders, they're the experts. You're on for the ride, you're in because you've got a set of tools that'll be useful. I hope that helps.
It does, thank you very much.
There are also some great resources popping up in the chat if folks are more curious about that. Accomplices, not allies is a good link that someone's put in there.
Yeah. Does this chat get saved with the recording?
It will, yep.
Oh, okay.
And we have a way to, yep, and I can send that to you.
Thank you.
There's another question here from Linda. Linda says, thank you for a very informative talk. I think you said currently First Nations have won more claims than lost. Linda asks, what distinguishes successful from unsuccessful land claims?
Oftentimes it's the judge sitting on the bench in litigation. But when you're going through the claims process, it's about making sure that you have covered every single angle absolutely possible. And there is no loose string in your evidence or your argument that they can pull on and unravel. I'll give you an example. I did, as an undergraduate student, I identified that my reserve, my community, had a potential specific claim. And so I did some research on it and I sent my report, which was an undergraduate paper, research paper, to my chief and said, I think we have a specific claim here. The next chief comes along, finds my report, calls me out and says, okay, well, this is interesting. We want you to do some research on this and see where it gets us. And so I did specific claims research on that. And so when I originally sent out the paper, it was 1984 to my chief. When the next chief came along and asked me to do the research on it, it was 1989. We had to go through the specific claims process, so it wasn't until 1994 that the process began. Okay, we went through, let's see, I actually have the date here. 1994 is when we launched it, and it was rejected. Oh, what year was that? It was rejected. I got it here. 1991. It was rejected 6 years later, right? And then we looked at all sorts of different options, and then we went and took it to the Specific Claims Tribunal. And last week, we finally got a comprehensive settlement. So that went from, we first launched it in 1994, right? No, 91. So that's over 30 years to get a specific claims validated and to go through the whole process and to reach a point where compensation package was being negotiated. 3 decades, man. That's insane, right? Yeah, luckily we were awarded costs, so that'll pay for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the communities had to put out to keep this claim alive.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but Michelle, I saw that your hand was raised earlier. Did you want to ask your question out loud?
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you to Miss Winona Wheeler, and I'm a fellow USS graduate. I'm working on my thesis for the PhD program in educational administration right now. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the timeline that's sort of extended all on its own. But what we kind of dismiss easily is this leadership and the 4-year terms, if you will. We're looking at, how do we help our leaders transfer information of these objectives that need to, be pushed through with more efficiency. So pushing the envelope, whose role is that? Is that the role of attorneys? Is that the role of, whose job is it to make sure that the knowledge transfer between government leaders after they're, if they're not reelected, for instance?
Oh, Michelle,
We might have lost Michelle.
Yeah, we lost her. She's
To
frozen.
a freeze. Winona, do you want to respond to the first part of that comment?
Oh, she's back. Michelle, are you back? Or are you still frozen?
Sorry, did I freeze?
We lost you briefly, yeah.
Okay, shoot. What did I say? Basically, can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Basically what I'm asking is there a transitional strategy that leaders in government use to make sure that essential programs and projects carry the kind of the same momentum as they would have if the leader were to stay in office? In other words, that knowledge transfer, or whose job is that? Is that coming from attorneys? Whose job is it to push the envelope there? Is it the people? Is it through solidarity? Is it through activism? Or how can we account our leaders to be those people to push the envelopes for us? So I'm just wondering who does that and what's the efficiency there?
Are you referring to land claims cases? Because that's, I can speak to that.
Yes.
Well, most times they don't know they have a land claims case unless one of the elders tells them, this piece of land used to be ours, or, we were promised that fishing reserve, right? So having that close connection with the community elders who have the collective history of the community lands and the traditional territories is absolutely fundamental. And it's those elders that'll get on their case. It's the elders that will say, you need to fix this. And once it's kick-started from the community level, then there's usually a lot of oomph to go because the elders will be on it, and on them to carry it forward. And you got to change. I mean, we always have changes of leadership at the community level, but there's always subcommittees too. There's a lot of subcommittees that help keep these long-term projects going, especially land claims cases that can take 30 years or more. I think we lost Michelle again.
Okay. Thanks, Winona. And thank you, Michelle, for that question. There's a related question, I think, in here in the chat from Amanda. Amanda writes, I really love what Winona said about starting with the oral history and not the archives. How much pre-research or questions would you suggest having before entering into a community, with the goal to be humble and flexible with what you learn along the way? Related, I think, to what you were saying about the elders sometimes coming forward with the story, with the information versus the other way around.
Yeah, you can't go in there looking like an idiot. I mean, you got to know, a little bit about their reserve. You got to know a little bit about who they are as a people. You got to do some preliminary research like we do as oral historians generally to prepare yourself, because you don't want to be in an interview with an elder and they're telling you something and you have no idea what they're talking about. You can't interrupt. You just don't. So you have to do enough. Like I had a map that showed me where they were, right? I had the band counselor that I was working with who would tell me about his people and tell me about the elders and tell me about the claims cases. So you do as much preliminary research as possible with what's out there. Yeah, you don't go in there as a blank slate because they'll think you're a fool for one thing, and it's not a strong place to come from. So I usually do as much research as I can before I go out in the field. Good question. Yeah.
There are a few kind of logistically minded questions here in the chat. One is about, from EOH, about when you have had a certain experience with a certain judge and know that same judge is appointed to your new case, do you prepare your claim approach based on your familiarity with that specific judge?
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't do the strategizing, but I have heard lawyers say, hell yeah, I know how this guy works. I know things. Yeah, and I've been in situations where lawyers have, when they prime you up to go out in the stand, they say, okay, now this judge is from here, this judge, this is where he comes from, this is his religious background or her religious background. They fill you in as much as they can on the positionality of the judge, right? And so you know what you're going in there for. Yeah, so you try to know the judges as much as you can as well.
And then the two other sort of logistical ones that are really interesting are, Belinda is asking if it's possible to lobby to change the laws to reduce the time frame for the claims conclusion. And then Jill is wondering, when continuing land claims started a while ago, is it possible to get the land rather than a payout?
Okay. I hope you remember the second one. I'll answer the first one.
Okay, I'll check.
I forgot what the first one was.
A lot of moving parts today. One of the questions was about any possibility to change the time frame for for a claims conclusion, and the other was about land versus payout.
Right. Okay. So the time frame for especially for specific claims, it's crazy long. And the original specific claims branch that they had set up in the specific claims process they set up, they realized, federal government realized it really was unwieldy. And so then they created the specific claims tribunal. And that tribunal had expanded authorities, and it also had the capability of expanding the definition of what constitutes a claim, and it had the authority to actually make decisions and to facilitate settlement. So the specific claims tribunal we have in place now was supposed to speed up the process, and it has considerably. However, it still takes a long time to get through. You know, it still takes years to get through the process. It doesn't take decades anymore, but it takes years. Yeah. Oh, getting the land back. Absolutely, getting the land back is what a lot of communities want. But the reality is that most of the land is now held by settlers. It's in fee simple. And so the federal government is not in a position to take it away from the settlers and give it back to the Native people. And that's what a lot of Canadians and US Americans are concerned about. You know, when Indigenous people say land back, we want our land back. They're scared of losing their homes, their cabins, and their pastures. They're frightened about that, but that's not what happens. Is in the US, like in Canada, you have big whacks of land that are not privately held. And those are under the jurisdiction of the provinces or state or the federal government, depending on the jurisdiction. And so it's from that mass of land that you're able to acquire lands to replace the lands that you've lost. So in the case of that 30 plus year specific claims case I did for my community, we get a settlement. You know, we're getting a financial settlement. And with that financial settlement, we have the option there of purchasing land and then having that land turn into reserve land, transforming it into reserve status. Or we can use that those funds differently. There's different kinds of cases. So we had a treaty land entitlement process up here in Saskatchewan. And the treaty entitlement process was resulted from the fact that at the time of treaties, not enough land was set aside according to the formula in the treaty to accommodate all the members. And so there was land missing. And so there was negotiated. We have an office of treaty commissioner here in Saskatchewan, and our political organization negotiated with the province and with the federal government to come up with a treaty land entitlement formula and framework to settle those outstanding claims. And so basically it was that each of the bands were awarded a monetary amount, and that money was required to be used for land purchases. So they could purchase land to make up for the land they lost. And then that land would revert to reserve status and become a part of the band's reserve lands. The reality is that they had to choose from vacant, what we call crown lands up here. And sometimes there were no vacant crown lands around the immediate communities, around the existing reserves. And so they had to purchase lands that were, they tried to purchase land within their traditional territory, but sometimes they purchased land that was outside their traditional territory. A lot of land purchases occurred in Saskatchewan, close to urban areas, and in Saskatchewan here where I live, we had the first urban reserves ever established, where treaty land entitlement, through treaty land entitlement, First Nations actually bought urban land in the city of Saskatoon. They bought hunks of land on the outskirts. They bought buildings within the city, and they bought businesses within cities, and the land within the city became the property of that First Nation, and that land got reverted into reserve status. So it's really kind of fun now. So now we've got these little checkerboard kind of urban areas where a little plop here is a reserve and a little plop here is a reserve, and it looks like nothing looks different, right? It all looks the same. So we have a lot of Indigenous First Nations businesses right in the cities in land that was purchased through treaty land entitlement. Yeah, so we do the best we can to get lands back that were lost, but in reality, in most cases, the lands that were lost are now held by private property. And so we have to make do with getting other lands to make up for it.
I feel like we've just started a whole new workshop on this topic. I'm like riveted, and also seeing the time. And I want to respect your time, Winona. And for anyone who has to leave now, thank you so much for being here. And please join me in thanking Winona and congratulating her on this wonderful talk. We have another event next week on Thursday, February 25th, Changing the Narrative on Gun Violence, our annual Brodsky Lecture. Winona, there are other questions in the chat, and I'm sure people have more questions for you. If you do have the time to stick around, I'm happy to stay and continue to hold this space. But if you have to leave, that's totally fine. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I can stick around for about another 15 minutes.
Amazing.
Okay.
Let me just now surf through all of these thank yous that are filling the chat to find the questions from before. I will definitely send you this. There is a lot of gratitude and love for you here.
Thank you, guys.
A question from further back that I'm sure this particular audience will be really curious about. Karen asked, in what ways is the research archived, this incredible research that you're describing? In what ways is it archived, and is it made publicly available at all?
Great question. So when I was just talking about the treaty land entitlement process here in Saskatchewan, we have an office of the Treaty Commission of Saskatchewan, and the treaty land entitlement process occurred in the late 80s and up to the mid 90s. And we've had 6 commissioners since then. So 6 new offices, and the most recent commissioner is the first Indigenous woman treaty commissioner we've ever had, and that's really awesome. And she has decided that she prioritized the development of an archives. And so actually last week was the grand opening of the Office of the Treaty Commissioner Archives. And so within that archives, you've got all of the reports and the research and the oral histories that were produced from all 5 of the previous treaty commissioners. You get this wealth of information, absolutely awesome. Not all of it's there, when you have different administrative changes, sometimes things go missing, but they've identified what should have been there, and they're trying to fill those gaps. But one of my former students, he is the one that's organized. He's the curator, the archivist who's organizing their entire collection, and it's really, really exciting. So the oral history stuff is all available to us, and he's in the process of digitizing it now, and eventually it'll all be available online. Well, not all. I mean, it's going to take years, I would think, to digitize everything online. But the Treaty Commission, Treaty Relations Commission in Manitoba has a research center as well. They've got a pretty fine collection. They haven't been directly involved in land claims cases. The reality is that the evidence generated by the plaintiffs, by the community that's launching the land claims, they own that evidence. But that evidence then goes into court, right? And so it becomes publicly accessible. And so and I try to get students to think about this, especially for thesis topics, that the oral history in the court recordings are absolutely amazing. But you'd have to go through 1,000 pages of court proceedings, right? And a lot of legalese. It's really hard sometimes to slug through that stuff. But the court proceedings themselves, the transcripts, are absolutely fascinating, and they're full of just amazing information, most of which never comes out in the judge's final decision. So I encourage people, if they're interested in that, to check out the court proceedings. Otherwise, like the research that I did for my First Nation belongs to my First Nation, and they're helping me out. They're paying for a research assistant for me right now to digitize everything. So the oral history work that we did in the early 90s has now all been digitized, and it'll all be going back to the community. And we'll be making, because the community wanted to protect the stuff, and we haven't, with the oral history, it's so important. It takes so much extra work when you're digitizing Indigenous oral history for public consumption, because in many, many cases, they give you things that are recorded just to you that you're not allowed to share. And so before we can make a lot of these recordings available to the public, we have to edit them. We have to take out the sacred teachings that are only supposed to be shared in ceremonial contexts or with family members. We have to take out a lot of information that the person that you're working with is only sharing with you, but hasn't given you permission to share. So we have to edit a lot of that stuff out before we can make the full recording public. And so what that means, because that's a huge amount of work, that there's a lot of material that's just not publicly accessible or publicly available at this time.
So exciting though. Thank you for sharing a bit more about that. There's a related question in here from Andrea. You mentioned the difficulty of utilizing Indigenous oral history as evidence, especially the testimonies of elders. Have considerations been given in finding possible methods to translate or convert these evidences into a format that the courts would be more receptive in accepting? Would that even be a possibility? I mean, I wonder with that question of digitizing and things being archived and becoming, in Western eyes, maybe more like static documents.
Yeah.
Does that change, right, the way that they're perceived in that setting? Do you have a sense of that?
It does. It does, because they're comfortable, they're safe, they're knowable, you know, they're familiar. But that's just totally ripping it out of its context. And the old people don't like that. That's not the context in which they should be shared. And so our position is, let's reverse that. Instead of trying to make the world easier for the judge, why don't we bring the judge out of his world and into ours to understand us in our terms, on our terms, in our context. Yeah. There's a question here from John Mason to everybody about the fear that settler-held land will be taken from them. Has there been any hostile backlash in the form of counter-protests and even vigilante action? Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, especially during the treaty land entitlement process. It was, man, oh man, it was scary at times, because we not only had to deal with the province and the federal government, we also had to deal with the rural municipalities, because the rural municipalities have based their revenues on taxes, right? Land taxes. And so when you take a hunk of land out of a rural municipality and transform it into Indian reserve, you've taken out that tax base for them. And so they lose money. And that's pretty scary for them. And so part of the deal was that the rural municipalities got money too, right? For letting go of potential tax income or losing tax income. Right? But man, oh man, it was, you know, we've got the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, and they were pretty vocal, and they were a force to contend with. There was a lot of backlash. You also had landowners that were jacking up the prices that they were asking for their land, like through the roof. Because they knew Indigenous people, First Nation people had money to buy. Second, because maybe they didn't really want them there anyway, right? And so the racism, as you know, in rural North America, in many regions in rural North America where there's close proximity to Indian reserves and reservations and settlers, tensions are high. There was a lot of backlash, and a lot of settlers, you know, screaming the Indians get everything for free mantra, right? And not willing to understand what was going on here. So yeah, there's always a lot of backlash.
Yeah. Thank you for finding that question. I was remembering it and trying to search through to find where that was listed. So thank you for finding that. Were there others that you had seen in the chat that you wanted to respond to, Winona? I have another one that I found, but if you have one on cue.
There's just one here. Can you build a community center and school with that money? It depends on the kind of claim and the kind of settlement package. Like I say, the treaty land entitlement settlement package, you could only buy land. That's it. But with the specific claims compensation packages, you can use that money for community development. And I'm trying to convince my chief right now to develop a heritage center on the reserve, where we can house all these boxes and boxes of documents and digital materials and stuff that we've collected over the years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done. The question
Okay.
you had.
Yeah, relatedly, John asked another question that Malvika also bumped in the chat. John said, I'd love to know when communities acquire other lands, how they resolve the fact that cultural identity / worldview can be bound up in the land that was lost.
A lot of times when they purchase lands that are outside their traditional territories, they purchase it for economic development purposes. So for example, on the outskirts of Saskatoon here, on the outskirts of the city, we have grasswoods, an area called Grasswoods. And I mean, this is Cree territory, right, in around Saskatoon, but it was English River Dene First Nation from up north that bought that land with their TLE package. And so now the Dene have this amazing business center and gas station with restaurants and the office of the Tree Commissioner office. They got big office space there, and that's owned by the Dene English River First Nation in the middle of Cree territory, right? Economic development. But you know, a lot of the Cree people utilize that space, you know. So it's outside their territory, but it's really valuable to them as economic development, and the funds are used then at the community level. And the reality is that we're not all on our reserves anymore. You know, more than 50% of us are urban. And so there's more, how would you say that? There's more collegiality, there's more interaction, there's more sharing in the urban areas because there's so many of us from different areas here. Yeah. Does that answer? Yeah.
John, I think, is nodding.
Hi, Barbara.
There are two questions about sort of the longevity of these materials and the archive. Mary had asked, is the material edited out, which you mentioned, the sacred knowledge, and before it's put in the archive, is the material edited out, retained for non-public access for First Nations peoples themselves? And then relatedly, Katie asks how you manage your files to ensure that they're treated appropriately once you've passed or once they go to an institution.
Yeah, they don't go to an institution.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're protected by family. Pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I did the thing again where I asked two questions and didn't give you a chance at the first one really, but
okay.
Back to Mary's about the material that's edited out. Is it retained in a non-public way for First Nations peoples themselves?
Yeah, that's the question I answered, I think.
Yeah, right. That a version stays home within the family and a version goes out. Yeah.
Yeah, we have in Saskatchewan here, we've got the Saskatchewan Indian Cultural Center, and in the 70s they had they interviewed hundreds and hundreds of elders, and they had elders focus groups in the 70s, and some of these guys were in their 80s. I mean, it was absolutely awesome. The sessions were held in their languages, and there's hundreds and hundreds of hours of audio recordings of these elder sessions. And they're held in SICC. However, you can't get access to any of that unless you get permission from your political leadership to get access to a specific recording. Right? And so they're doing their best to protect that. So there's a lot of sacred teachings in there. Some of the recordings have songs on them. ceremonial songs. And so you have to go through, and it's not publicly accessible. That's all there is to it. It's just not. Yeah.
There's one last question in the chat, and then if anyone else has questions they want to add or ask out loud, please feel free in these last minutes. But Irene asks how law students can support this work.
Law students. I don't know. I never thought about that. I think we have in our law school here, we have a Native Law Center. And the Native Law Center has one Native lawyer and an elder, Maria Campbell, who's working at the Native Law Center at U of S. And there's a couple of Indigenous profs. And so they have all sorts of volunteer activities for the law students to go through. I don't know if land claims work is any, if they're offering volunteer opportunities for students to do land claims research or not, because I'm not a lawyer working over there, so I don't know precisely what they do. But I know that the students do a lot of volunteer work. And I know, of course, that they really assess and they study the land claims cases carefully too in the Indigenous law classes. Yeah.
Wonderful. Does anyone else out there? Yeah, Mary, go ahead. Oh, you're muted though, Mary.
Hi, Mary.
Zooming, I remember how to do that, wouldn't you? I'm curious to know, Winona, the extent to which younger people in the First Nations have become sort of swept into or involved with some of these land claims efforts.
Well, when a community decides to start researching its land claims case, I found that in most instances, they try to rely on their own community members. And there's always summer student grant money available. When I was working on the Fisher River case, we got grant money for 5 summers in a row to hire 5 undergraduate students. And I trained them in oral history, and they interviewed all the elders in the community at that particular time. And in the process, they learned about the claims process. So I think that most communities try to use their own community resources, and that allies and those of us who work with them are strongly believe in capacity building. And so we train local people to do it themselves. And that's one of the things I wish I could do more up here, and I'm hoping to do in the future is to develop training institutes specifically for local communities here dealing with local issues and local needs, to better prepare communities to do most of their own research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Winona. We have already kept you so long. I know it's been a long evening. Thank you so much for sticking on these extra 15 minutes and for all of the work that you're doing and all of these teachings that you've shared. And thank you all for sticking around and being here. Jill, your question about, is that a question about audio recording? Feel free to send me an email. We have lots of ideas and things about audio recording quality. Great that you're doing that project. But thank you all so much. Hope to see some of you in the coming weeks at more of these workshop events. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you.